Hello, welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight in celebration of the intimate city. My name is Sophia, and I'm a bookseller here at the Seminary Co-op. Just a little bit about our bookstores before we get started. Some of you might already know we were founded in 1961, and in 2019 we became the country's first and only not-for-profit bookstore whose mission is bookselling. This mission recognizes bookselling as a cultural endeavor, with booksellers as professionals and bookstores as civic institutions that support their community. We invite you to browse, probably not right now, and to learn more about our co-op and our sister store, 57th Street Books, by visiting semcoop.com, or of course, by speaking to a bookseller such as myself after the event. One of the main ways you can support our stores is by buying a book. I know of a great one, The Intimate City, perhaps. If you aren't already, you can become a member when you make your purchases this evening, where you can earn credit back. It's very easy, and most importantly, it's free. A few quick housekeeping notes. First, we ask that everyone remain masked during the duration of the event and during the book signing. There will be time for audience questions at the end, so should you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand at that time. You might be wondering why I'm speaking into a mic that's not being projected. We will be passing around this mic during the Q&A. It's to pick up your voices for an audio recording. Okay, and with that, I'm thrilled to announce our event for this evening. This event is presented in partnership with the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization, also known as CEGU. Based in the Division of Social Sciences at the University of Chicago, CEGU is an interdisciplinary platform for critical thinking, advanced research, and innovative pedagogy on the societal and spatial dimensions of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other kinds of environmental transformation. Here tonight with CEGU is Professor Evan Carver, who will now introduce you to our other guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Seminary Co-op, and thanks all of you who are in the audience who've taken some of your pre-dinner time to talk about cities here with us. So I'm honored to be joined by Michael Kimmelman, who is the architecture critic for the New York Times. He was formerly the chief art critic for the New York Times. While he was based in Berlin, Germany, he started the Abroad column, and he's currently heading a new venture which is quite fascinating called Headway, looking at big problems but focusing on potential solutions to those problems. So, for example, recent series on Houston and what Houston has been doing about its homelessness problem. Some really impressive examples of success there in Houston. But Michael is a New Yorker, and we're here to talk about his most recent book, which is a tribute to New York in many ways. The book is structured as a series of 20 walks with some people that you might expect to know quite a lot about the city, historians, architects, that kind of thing. But if you read Michael's most recent article in the Sunday Times, it's a review of an addition to the Natural History Museum in New York, done by our hometown hero, yes, right. Jeannie Gang. But in the piece, Michael sort of bemoaning, at least lightly, the transition in cultural and intellectual history away from wonder cabinets, as they're sometimes called, toward this more kind of enlightened version of knowledge that's embodied in modern museums with their rational kind of encyclopedic understanding of the world. And so one of the things that I appreciate about the book is I think you have given us a sort of a Wunderkammer here, in that it does not attempt to be a sort of omniscient encyclopedic picture of the city, but instead gives us a series of charming stories, unbelievable anecdotes that add up to a picture of a place that is idiosyncratic, personal, totally delightfully non-linear, but is doing some really interesting things, reminding us that to appreciate New York City, we should not only admire the neo-Gothic architecture of the Brooklyn Bridge, but that we should maybe consider the stains of the betel leaf juice at Diversity Plaza in Queens. That we should, admire the astounding engineering that's going to create the super tall buildings, but also remember that Trinity Church was built with mortar using oyster shells, the mundane to the lofty. So it adds up to a picture of a place that is astounding and yet also lived in, and not just lived in by the people that you're spending time there with, but one that I, at least, felt that I could imagine myself also living in. So as someone who reads a lot about cities and occasionally writes about them myself, I know that's a very difficult thing to do. So I'm curious to hear how you did that.
Well, sure.
Thank you for joining us, Michael.
No, thank you so much, Evan. And thank you for hosting this here, this incredible bookstore. Isn't it a joy to be in a bookstore like this and also together again? Let's always remember, it wasn't so long ago we couldn't do this. And that was where this book began, as a matter of fact. I'm not going to read the whole thing, trust me. But I'll just read you the opening because, the introduction, because what happened is COVID shut down the city. And like everybody else, I was panicked and worried for my family and whatever. But I also was curious how I might reconstruct my own life. And even in those very early days, extremely early days, you may remember, there was, I think we were all looking for something to hold on to. And for me, I realized looking out my window on the empty streets that was New York. It was actually right before the streets emptied, and I'll just read this to you here. I said, this book started with an email I sent at 1:32 p.m. on March 13, 2020. New York had confirmed its first cases of what would be the worst public health crisis in a century. Museums and Broadway theaters had closed their doors, and Governor Andrew Cuomo had declared a state of emergency. I wrote to several architects, writers, planners, and friends. I said, with everything shuttering and people increasingly likely to feel stir crazy at home, I'm thinking of doing a modest series for the Times, architectural walks around the city, in which I am taken on these tours by different people. The goal is obvious: distraction, joy, consolation. People can still go outside after all. Getting out is healthy. We get to see other people that way, as well as see that we're not alone. See examples of how this city remains beautiful, inspiring, uplifting. This isn't anything new or difficult, I wrote them. I've been thinking about the noon concerts at the National Gallery in London during the Blitz. These would be brief tours, and my companions could be architects, historians, preservationists, anyone interesting and interested. That includes you. Any thoughts? Feel like taking a walk? So I sent that email out. And I'll just tell you, the London Blitz concert I'm referring to is that in just before the Blitz started, Londoners started to prepare for it, and things began to shut down. Theaters and other things began to shut down. And the National Gallery in London, whose director then was a man named Kenneth Clark, started to move all the pictures out of the building, except for the idea that he would keep one. He got approval to keep one on view, so that people could come and see something in the museum. There would always be something there to show people that the museum was there, art was there, life goes on. And a woman, a pianist, in my other life I'm a pianist, so I knew about this, a woman named Myra Hess had a proposal, and that proposal was to stage concerts, actually not at noon, but at 1 p.m., once in a while in the National Gallery. They didn't know if anybody would come, but the same impulse. Life goes on, we have fortitude, we will survive, let's do something beautiful together. So she started to give these concerts. I'll just say the first one the piano was set up, she was practicing. They had no idea whether 5 people would show up or nobody would show up or 100 people would show up. And they put up some chairs in the gallery. And Clark came in to talk to Hess and say, we have a problem. And she said, well, what's the matter? He said, the line stretches out the door across Trafalgar Square and around the block. There are thousands of people who want to come. It turned out to be one of the most sort of symbolic and beautiful things that happened in London during the Blitz. So I wanted to do something as well that would distract people, as I said, but also remind people of the fact that cities, and a city like New York especially, are enduring, and that they've been through, New York has been through many, many ups and downs. It's been through epidemics before. And that this was an endeavor we were still doing together, even if we were isolated in our apartments and needed to be away from each other. There was something about the city that was, I thought, an important lesson for all of us, but also something that people would read that was not more doom scrolling. So there was something banal about this. On some level, I just wanted people to have something that seemed larger than themselves and larger than that moment and not disastrous. I wrote a book some years ago called Portraits, and that was where it was a similar idea, so that was on my mind. In that case, I took artists around the Metropolitan Museum. The idea was to see the same thing Rashomon-like, to show people that there's no single correct way to look at art, that artists look at art in a million different ways, and I thought that would be liberating and interesting and educational for me too. And then as that series took off and grew into a book, a lot of other artists piped in. They wanted to do that, so I walked around with Lucian Freud in London and with Balthus in Switzerland and so forth. But the idea was the same, sort of show that this thing is, in that case art, in this case the city, is this incredibly complex and open concept, and that there are a million different ways of looking at it. So I had the same impulse here, and I have to say, as it caught on, I think in part because really it was the only thing that wasn't, just leading us all to suicide. I thought there's something larger I can make of this. And so I wanted the book also to do something else, which is to have as wide as reasonably possible a representation of different kinds of voices, to represent something of the diversity of the city, the diversity of its neighborhoods, but also the diversity of types of people who have contributed to the city. So, as Evan mentioned, I talked to an engineer about the engineering of some of the great buildings, the skyscrapers of mid-century modernism. And I also talked to an architect who was an emigre to America about some of those same buildings. I talked to a community organizer in Mott Haven in the Bronx. I talked to a historian of LGBTQ history about my neighborhood where I grew up, which is the Village. I talked to a landscape architect about Forest Hills, which was a little version of the City Beautiful. Not to say that the book represents even the tiniest fraction, but is somehow an indicator that the city is something we all put together. It's not just something that architects built over time. And I think, just to get to your other point, and then I'll shut up. So for me, the city is layered. The neighborhoods and places are layered by memory. And I remember when I came back from Berlin to write for the Times Magazine about my father, I came back to a Greenwich Village that was, had become much richer and looked entirely different superficially. But I decided to take a walk with my upstairs neighbor in the apartment building I grew up in, who was an Italian kid who came from he was a working class guy who remained essentially in the world that he occupied in the village. The village had never changed for him. And it was like going through one of those doors in Harry Potter. I superficially saw the change in the city, and then walking with him, it was like I'd gone back into the village that I knew. There was the woman who was still selling magazines and newspapers in the tobacco shop. There was the guy sitting on the lawn chair outside the fruit market on Bedford Street. And there was that, the city is full of these sort of pentimenti and layers. And so some of the projects, I call them projects, some of the walks are really memoirs. And I think that's an important thing too. Why do we go someplace? We go someplace, you go to Paris to look at the Louvre because on some level, all the misery of the travel and everything, you do that because somehow having yourself physically in a place is coming to possess it in some way. It's a little part of you. And I think each of us plants those flags whenever we are in a place. It becomes a part of us. So unpacking the way a city works like that, I think, is also one of the ambitions of the book. And it was, I have to say it was enormous fun. Because for me, it was a distraction too. Professionally speaking, I couldn't do my job in a normal way. And it's interesting to be put in a situation where you have a problem and you come up with a solution that you sort of was forced by the situation, and therefore is almost all the more beautiful for being difficult. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did I shut you up? Is that it? Yep.
No, I think there's a lot of different directions we could go. One question that I have is, I think, most journalism involves at some point talking to some people. And so technically the journalist has to decide, how do I incorporate this quote here?
Yeah.
But here you have presented most of these as dialogues, and you're giving the subject, whoever the
Right.
partner on the walk, a lot of the airtime. So can you talk a little bit about why you took that strategy as opposed to sort of a more traditional prose style?
So I also felt that I wanted to do something very human. I think we were all feeling frightened and alienated, and that we were not encountering people. So it was very important to have a kind of intimacy in those conversations. The first walk I did was with an architect named David Rockwell. He's a very famous architect on Broadway, and he's done a lot of shows and also lots of restaurants and commercial things. And David's a figure in New York, but he's very close to Broadway. And so Broadway had just shut. So the first thing I thought was, what does Broadway look like now? And I work there. So I met him on 42nd Street. And this was like from one day to the next. You're going to your office, and then the next day you go back to that place. And I know this was true everywhere, but just try to picture, you go to Times Square, you come out of the subway at Times Square, and it's like, tumbleweeds. And there were two people, one guy in an Elmo costume and another in some other costume, and they were waiting for marks. Those are people who usually hang out in Times Square and hit up people for, cash and stuff. And they were just alone on 42nd Street. There was a guy at a hot dog stand selling nothing, and three completely clueless Italian tourists walking down the street, and that was it. And so David and I, trying to figure out even how we related to each other, started to walk around the neighborhood. And I have to say, it was eerie and really disturbing, and also clearly very beautiful. You felt that time had stopped, that there was something incredibly special about this. You would never, ever see this again. That moment, that pause, let you see things that you don't ordinarily look at. And that's in the nature of walking. If you're actually not hurrying someplace, but you're taking a walk. I talk in the introduction about this, the Spazierengehen in German, or the notion of a flaneur in France. It's not people who are sort of on the march, but people who are sort of taking in the things that they're seeing. And this was a moment for that. But to do it together was the really crucial thing. This idea that we would take this walk, this physical thing. So all the chapters are set up with at least the conceit that you could do these walks from beginning to end. And I wanted all these people to be speaking directly for themselves so that they would speak more personally. Otherwise, it would seem like an architecture history book or something. So the trick for me was writing this in such a way that the dialogue seemed totally natural. And I mean, everybody said what's here, but there were hours and hours of tapes. And that I could insert enough information so that it would do what you needed to do. First of all, that everything is accurate, because not every fact is on the tip of your tongue. But also, that if we're referring to a building, we don't remember the name of the architect or an engineer or the date of a law that was passed or what the name of that restaurant was that used to be there before it was replaced, something like that. And the last thing I'll say about that is I really wanted, as a New Yorker, for this to be news to New Yorkers. So the trick was writing something that people in Chicago or anywhere else would find fun and interesting and informative and meaningful for their own cities, but that also, know-it-all New Yorkers would not know. That was always the bar for me. And that was a ball. So I learned just an enormous amount. That was super fun. Like I never knew, that Rockefeller Center had special pipes built for laughing gas, because early on when the Depression hit, they realized they needed to have people come in there. They needed to appeal to certain kinds of businesses, so they wanted dentists. So I never knew why I got my passport with my mother at Rockefeller Center. Now I know why, because little weird things like this, but they give you this sort of handle on the city to unpack it that way. The city is a trillion, zillion of these kind of beautiful details.
Yeah. Why did you get your passport at Rockefeller Center?
Well, because
it wasn't because of the laughing gas.
No. My dentist was actually a block away. He obviously didn't take up Rockefeller Center's offer of free laughing gas. No, because Rockefeller Center was set up as a trade-free zone, which is why the two buildings. Does everyone here know what Rockefeller Center is? So I'll just tell you, because I didn't know all this before. Rockefeller Center had been owned by Columbia University, which bought this land, but it was actually really a bunch of rundown tenements, and it was slums. But as the area began to develop, Columbia kept sort of holding out, trying to figure out what it would do with this land. And patrons of the Metropolitan Opera persuaded John D. Rockefeller III to buy this from Columbia to put the Metropolitan Opera there. Then, this was like a week before the stock market crashed. Then the stock market crashed and they said, you know what, we thank you for buying this land, but we really don't have the money to pay to build the Opera House. Rockefeller was furious. And so he said, I will build something else. I'll build a commercial development that will, sort of be the world's most amazing commercial development. It turned out to be the largest development project in America between the wars. So it employed over 70,000 people, including in many other cities where materials came from. And part of the idea was to do this sort of monument Art Deco architecture and to create this incredibly beautiful urban space with different, Raymond Hood designed this, and with different scales of buildings and with a kind of promenade. If those of you who've been there will know, there's no gate or door, but along Fifth Avenue, between these two pavilions, the French and the British pavilions, which were free ports for the French and the British, so brought in goods from those countries. And then the Italian one is just to the north. So when the war started, if you look, there are actually still fascist symbols on it. They had to do something else. That's when the dentists moved in, because the Italians had to move out. But between the French and British pavilions, there's this path that leads down to the skating rink. Even if you've never been, you've probably watched 30 Rock or something. So that leads down, and then there's the main building, or sometimes called 30 Rock. So that change in grade, the way the path goes down, with these very beautiful sculptures, and helps sort of augment that the enormity and that beautiful lift of the skyscraper of 30 Rock, which I think was Alice Toklas or Gertrude Stein said doesn't so much rise up as come out of the ground. It's this very beautiful sort of blossoming thing. That's partly because of the way that path works, how you perceive this, and it frames that view. And so, I think it's just this incredibly beautiful urban agglomeration. So I went around with a guy named Dan Okrent, who literally wrote the book on, who's an old friend of mine, on Rockefeller Center. And we made it around one block, but it's a big block, so that was sort of fun. So stuff like that. I mean, I'd been there. Why did I get a passport there with my mother? Because my mother would sometimes go to Midtown, would go uptown so she could shop and drag me along as a little boy. And then we'd walk back to the subway on 6th Avenue through Rockefeller Center. So that was a part of that was one of the stations of the cross. We would stop in Rockefeller Center for ice cream or skating or shopping or a passport. So.
And I think you noted that a whole kind of agglomeration grew up around the passport office of travel agents and luggage and all of this. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the joys of doing my job is to animate the built world, because as you say, I was an art critic, and as I told you, I spend a lot of time with artists, and I found, and my mother was a sculptor, I found that work interesting, but there's something to me really kind of astonishing about the fact that architecture exists in the public realm, and that the buildings we build, the streets we make, this is such a collective endeavor, and the city is the greatest representation of that. I think it's the most beautiful thing we've ever done as humans, because there is a collective understanding that we're sharing this space, right? There are things we are doing and things we're understanding. You guys are sitting close to each other. There are things we do collectively in a city that is a kind of an agreement that the thing that us together is better than what we would have if we were alone. And that's always the compact of the things we build. That everything that is put out there somehow has to exist, not just except for a private house in the country or whatever. But I mean, everything in the public realm, which is what I write about, it's built for someone, but it also is something we share. And the city, a city like New York brings so many different kinds of places and neighborhoods and communities together. It's still just, it amazes me
just amazes me. Because growing up there, I didn't necessarily spend a lot of time in Mott Haven or, you name it, East New York or whatever. And now my job gives me the excuse and privilege to go around and talk to people in different places. I highly recommend doing what everyone says sounds like a great idea they'll do and then nobody ever does, which is something a friend of mine, a man named Alex Garvin, who died last year. He was a city planner and taught at Yale, but he was in the city administrations in New York for 50 years. And he grew up in Queens. And when he was young, he would make it a sort of a weekend chore or task, privilege, to go to a subway station he'd never been to and just get out and walk around. And, what you find is just amazing. I always mention this to people and they're like, that's a great idea. And then nobody does it because it's too hard to organize one's life that way. But if you do, for work, have to do that, it's mind-blowing, really mind-blowing.
Well, I have sort of a follow-up question. The book is a series of walks with, experts in one thing or another. What advice would you have for those of us who might want to explore our city on foot and come to appreciate it better if we don't exactly have like David Adjaye on the phone or Daniel Okren or famous intelligent friends?
Well, then you're stuck. I don't know what to say.
Might as well stay at home.
Yeah, just stay at home. In defense of these guys, I didn't think. I could have just walked around with a bunch of my old, classmates from PS41, but I don't think that it would have been interesting to other people. So I did want to walk around with people who had some relationship to these places that would be interesting beyond themselves. So what we were doing was giving you a virtual experience of a walk by conducting a conversation around what we were seeing, what you would theoretically see. But honestly, what it's really about is this idea that you go and open your eyes. I always felt this way about the art world, and I really feel it's true about cities, that we're often blinded or hindered by the fear or insecurity that we're not seeing the right thing, that we don't know what we're supposed to be seeing. So somehow we can't see. And so I think part of the point is that, sure, you might go to Rockefeller Center and not know about the dentists or whatever, but that doesn't really matter. You can find that out, and you can do that here. I just went today for an hour to go look at the Pullman neighborhood, and I picked up what I could, but it was extraordinary. I thought, wow, and you have to. I think we have to be kinder to ourselves and just open our eyes and let us see what we get. I think we're too concerned about that idea that you have to know something before you see it. And that's certainly true about art. I think it's really true about neighborhoods too. And then the other message here, which I've said now already, is that everyone puts their own story on a place. Everyone has their own version of a thing. Some of you have been to some of the neighborhoods I'm describing, and in the book, and already have some sense of it yourself. And I believe that's one of the building blocks of the city. We add these things together collectively, even if we don't know each other's parts. So I just think, just do it and see where you go. It's hard to do. We do it when we assign ourselves that test. We're tourists or something. but we are less inclined to do it in our own homes, our own cities, which is odd. But I don't know why that is. It's actually, it should be more rewarding because you can go back and back. So, I mean, in Jackson Heights, which is a neighborhood I highly recommend to all of you in Queens, I know I took some kids there too for a class I did. I went around with Suketu Mehta, who's a friend and a writer, and Suketu came from India when he was young with his family, and so he basically just talks about his years as a teenager. In the process, describing this incredible neighborhood. And so, is he an expert? I don't know. I mean, he certainly knew more about it than I did, but mostly he was just telling you what it was like to be there, which I thought was really hilarious, actually. And the same thing with Lucy Sant, when she lived in the East Village. So for her, she was essentially describing something lost, a lost part of the city, a lost time. And that is also, an experience one has in a neighborhood. It wasn't, she's no expert on architecture or buildings, but, and I very purposely did for the book a chapter on the village that was not about what I knew, but was a history of the gay village, because it was something that I knew of growing up, and villagers were proud of that, but not something I knew enough about. So I wanted to sort of see the village fresh through someone else's eyes. And one can do that just by walking with a friend.
Yeah. I'll ask one more question, and then I think we open up to the crowd. I know a lot of you, and knowing you, I'm sure you have some great questions. But I want to ask just one last question that's sort of about the book, but might kind of take us beyond the book a little bit also. On this topic of loss, I suppose, I think a lot of us are still feeling kind of a sense of loss, kind of post-COVID, trying to figure out, what life can look like again, especially like collective public life.
Right.
One of the hopeful anecdotes, one of the really sort of, I think happy anecdotes in the book is when you are on 42nd Street, you and Rockwell point out that a lot of these storied theaters were in fact built right after the Spanish flu, right after the 2018-2019 influenza pandemic.
Right.
So which had, of course, shut down the city. And so there was a rebound there.
Right.
So my question for you is, now it's May of 2023. I'm not asking you to prognosticate, but more sort of from what you see now. What do you see that you in the way that cities are emerging from COVID? What do you see that you think is going well? What do you see that's maybe not going so well?
So let me say just a few things about that. The other thing about this, right, is that it is a snapshot of a moment, and I did realize that as this went along, I would be able to create something that left a mark of a time, and the chapters are full of sort of allusions to hope, in a way, because who knew how things would come out. I'm going to answer your question, but I'll do it a little indirectly to say that I think the in the background was always this idea, as you said, about the Spanish flu, that the city had been through various episodes and had come out of it always. So there's an important story that is in the first chapter in which I walk around with Eric Sanderson, who wrote a book called Mannahatta, and he's an ecological historian and a geographer, and he studied the ecology and landscape of Manhattan before the Dutch arrived. And so I met him at Lower Manhattan, and we pretended it was 1609 when Henry Hudson's boat, we were one of the Lenape, and Henry Hudson's boat was coming into the harbor. What was it like at that moment? And I can tell you more about that, but it was, talk about mind-blowing, and it was so much fun that then we did it again in the Bronx and stood in Yankee Stadium when it was a salt marsh. But in that chapter, Eric and I talk about what happened to the collect pond. Give me a second, and I just want to say this, because I think it is a metaphor for the city, and reminds us how time works, and that we have to have different notions of time. So for 1,000 years, the Lenape had occupied Manhattan and used a freshwater pond, very deep freshwater pond. It came to be called the Collect Pond, which is where the courthouses are in Lower Manhattan. I don't know why I'm giving you these TV references, but if you've ever watched Law and Order, that's right there. So that was the Collect Pond. And as the Dutch and then the English and then the early Americans started to build out Lower Manhattan, they started to sort of build around the Collect Pond, including putting some tanneries on the Collect Pond. Tanneries are highly polluting. So, in fact, the early Americans polluted their own fresh water source, committed essentially suicide. And so what happened? There were outbreaks of cholera, there were lots of deaths, people started leaving Lower Manhattan. It was a big deal. And Aaron Burr had a really novel idea. I will build a new sewer system, water system for Lower Manhattan, bring fresh water in here, but I need money, so I need the authority to start a bank. And if you give me that money, I will then do this company to build this sewer system. So he did, and the sewer system was a complete fiasco and shambles, and there were further outbreaks of cholera. It was a disaster. Burr was, in fact, lying, I think, and just left this to people who had no concerns. So there were many more deaths, but he got his bank. And the fact that this was a problem forced New York to come up with another water source. So that created the Croton Reservoir system, which is a reservoir north, about 40, 50 miles north of the city, which then flowed down. It's one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century, and created a series of reservoirs in places along the way, including in what became Central Park, what became the 42nd Street Library. And so accidentally, or whatever, these catastrophes produced the development of Manhattan far beyond Lower Manhattan. It created Central Park, it created the 42nd Street Library, it brought water into all these neighborhoods which had never had it before. It was part of the thing that created New York. And the bank is JP Morgan Chase, the world's largest bank. So we got our banking system and we got New York City out of that calamity. It took several decades, but the point is you don't always know what's happening next year or next month. So now I will finally answer your question. I resisted, one of the reasons I did this is because I resisted doing that prognosticating. There was a real pressure to announce what was about to happen, and a lot of pressure to sort of lean into the catastrophe. I just knew from history that I knew nothing. I didn't know what was happening next hour anyway, much less what was going to happen. So having said that, I sort of stuck with the idea that, by 2025 we'll have a better sense of whether or not the commercial real estate market will recover, whether the people will be back in their offices, whether the cities will sort of rebound to the same. 2025 is what developers were saying to me in the early months of the pandemic, because they always have timelines that are much longer than the rest of us. At the moment, things are looking troubling for New York, and I think for other cities too. You have insane, real estate values, but you have a largely dead Midtown office market, and that's, as in other cities, a very crucial source of revenue. And there are things that happen when revenue falls. I was writing to protect the libraries from being shut down, which fortunately Adams, has now agreed to do. But things like that, once you have those cracks, they can create further problems. So I don't know what the answer is, but I also know that we're still going to take a little bit longer to know. And I don't know if all of you would agree with this, but 2 years ago, it was, even a year ago, it was hard to imagine. You're all wearing masks, I get it, but generally we don't now. And we don't think about it really that much. And I think, we're amnesiac. That's the way we survive. It's also a disaster when it comes to remembering our mistakes, but it helps us, I think, survive. So I'm a little more optimistic than my colleagues, let's say, at the Times. I really hope I'm proven right. So,
great.
Do you guys have questions?
Yeah, I think Carlo has a mic, or no? Okay, Sophia's got a mic. So, yeah.
About whatever, the book or whatever. I'm happy to
questions do you have?
Chat. Yeah.
Okay. First, thank you so much for doing this.
Of
really
course.
appreciate you coming here.
Thank you for coming.
Obviously, you included a lot of discussions about walks that you had throughout the city, but were there any walks that you went on in the city that you didn't include for some reason or another? Or was there anything that you intentionally left out because either it didn't fit the narrative or...
Oh God, there were, well, so I didn't do walks that, this was labor intensive. None of this was like, none of these people sort of like, I called them up in the morning and said, yeah, I'll meet you at 2:00, and we just, that is not what happened. These are, there was a lot of, these were cooked. So it took a lot of time. So I did not want to put out people who were incredibly generous and busy and say, I didn't think you were that interesting, so I'm just gonna, that happens all the time as a journalist. You put people out and you interview them and it doesn't fit or something. But there were millions of things that we talked about that I couldn't include. I wanted these to have a certain scale. A walk is a certain thing. If it's too long, it's not fun. And reading a walk is a different pace. So there's a certain, I didn't want them to become, I don't know how to put it. I didn't want them to become a trudge. So that was a discipline, how to pare things down and maintain a tone and a certain humor. Because you don't take a walk to sort of, have a lecture on. And I think especially, that makes sometimes tours really boring. Does it really matter if that was built in 1892 or 1894? Just, you're trying to get something out of that walk. So there were details like that were left out. But no, what was undone was that there were a lot of other neighborhoods, a lot of other people I wanted to talk to and I have other work to do. So it could have gone on. The question was, what is the right balance and what sort of constitutes a thing? And this seemed to me, like one solution. Were you asking for something that I had, like something that's like, I really wish I'd gotten this in? I don't remember something like that offhand.
No,
So-
I was just curious.
Yeah, yeah.
Annie.
Yeah, hi. Also, like,
I don't think that's working, by the way,
I
is
don't
it?
think it's working either, so I'll just talk.
Yeah, yeah,
For the
yeah.
recording, just hold it.
Oh, it's for the recording. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you again for your talk. I was wondering if you felt like this way of kind of seeing as you see and just kind of taking things in around you. That experience. Do you think it's unique to walking through a city, or do you think that this can be lifted and applied in other contexts, like out in the rural countryside,
Oh, of
in a
course.
park, in a suburb, even?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in the book. I mentioned that remark by Quindaro about, there's a slowness about seeing, and I think the problem in suburbs is that you're in a car, and you tend to be. Of course, there's no reason why you can't. I mean, look, people go to the country to sit and stare at the trees in the sky, and so there's a certain, obviously, inherent stoppage, just pause, that you're supposed to take if you make a trip into the country. Or if you go on a hike, quite intentionally, you climb a mountain, what are you doing? You do it to look at the view. We forget, by the way, that didn't always used to be the case. There's a certain moment in history when people started to climb mountains for the view. Before that, mountains were the most horrible, the terrifying sublime was the great phrase. They were the things you wanted to avoid. They were God's revenge on man for the fall, and then they became this thing which you climb up just so you can look out from. So I think that's embedded in the way people imagine trips through certain kinds of countryside. But suburbs are hard. I mean, this is the problem, right, with cars. You see things in a different way. I love driving and going through, if you're going through the West or something, you're not going to walk it. So the car is a way of seeing. But the city is too detailed, and there are too many things going on, sensory things, smells and sounds and stuff, that you really can't get if you're in a car. Yeah, and I would stress that too, that I think the multi-sensory nature of the city, you're not just seeing, I keep saying that, but actually you're doing lots of other things. You're hearing, you're smelling, you're feeling the grade of a block in your feet and your legs. You're feeling the distance, the difference between a city block, a regular numbered block, and an avenue block, and these things register in your body, and they give you, and one needs to be open to that. So yeah, it would be a different thing writing a book about suburbs, for sure. I'm not the man to do it. Over here?
Noam in the back, Harrison.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, sure.
I'm curious if the scope of this series changed for you from that initial email when the pandemic was just a 2-week shutdown versus when you were completing this book and the
Yeah.
pandemic was this era of change, and how your conversations that you had walking the city empty might have been different from how you would have these conversations when it was
Later.
full. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the beginning, I thought I would focus on the things that had shut. So Broadway, and then I did Museum Mile because the museums were closed. And then I realized, okay, this is going on. And also the reaction to it was good, so I thought I should go on. There were technical things about the form, because I was making up this form. I mean, I wasn't inventing calculus, But I'm just saying, everything has its own little quirks. And this did too. What is the length of the introduction? What kind of information do you put there? Just lots of stuff like that. So that evolved a little bit because you need to establish a form and stick with it, but you need to tweak it as the terms change. As for COVID itself, I did a number of these virtually. So that was because we couldn't get together, or my interlocutors did not want to. But that also allowed us to use Google Maps and to also refer to things when we were walking. So that did change how we could strategize and plan these things. And then as the sort of city opened again, it was very important to me to contain that in the walks. So Chinatown is something I'd wanted to do early on. There were attacks on Asian Americans very early on. Chinatown was one of the hardest hit neighborhoods for a number of reasons, one of which is that physically people love it because I'm talking about Manhattan's Chinatown. There are many Chinatowns in New York City. There are 3 that are big. Manhattan's Chinatown is the smallest of those 3. Just to understand the scale of New York, even here in Chicago, it can be kind of shocking. And so if you know it, it's little streets and little shops, and people love that, but that's catastrophic during COVID. But it was also the xenophobia. Trump was also coming out about the Chinese, and so I really wanted to speak up for that neighborhood and let people there speak for themselves. So I really wanted to do that one in person and to do it a little differently, to talk to some of the shopkeepers and to walk around with a woman who ran an institution there. And then to talk about how resilient that neighborhood has always been and how resilient the Chinese have been since they were brought over here essentially and then told we didn't welcome them. So Chinatown was always a kind of haven and something of a safe haven for people there, but also a very strong sort of, not insular exactly, but self-reliant community. And that is not something I would have written in the same way at the beginning as I was able to do at the end. Likewise with the chapters that came after the series ended in the Times, they're quite different. The one in the Village is just different than what I would. It's longer. It has a different character to it. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, but that's all we have time for today.
It is?
So we're going to wrap up. If any of you has any concluding words, please feel free.
No, just to thank Michael again for all the time he spent with us this evening and
it's a pleasure.
throughout the rest of your stay, and the Seminary Co-op for hosting us this evening, and all of you for spending some time with us. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.